If there's one thing Danish politics is famous for, it's a focus on immigration and a hardline approach on that. Other countries have recently started looking to Denmark for inspiration. Recently, for example, the UK government has announced its plans to adopt the Danish model.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will later today be showing the full details of my plans for far-reaching reforms to the UK asylum system to restore order and control to our borders. We have learned the lessons from our international partners, including Denmark, where fundamental reform to their system has seen asylum claims at a 40-year low. The impact of this government's plans will be to restore order and control to the border so we can be the open, tolerant and generous country that we know ourselves to be.
That begs the question, what is the Danish model? Does it work? And what are the impacts of it on Danes and migrants in Denmark alike? So I've come here to Copenhagen to investigate. I've met with a handful of Danish politicians as well as some organizations to try to answer these questions. First, we'll take a look at the history of the Danish immigration debate, with focus on the last 25 years or so. Then we'll dive into what the policy of today is and where the government currently stands. Then we'll look at the outcomes of this policy and some of the criticisms lodged against it, both from the right and the left. Before we start though, a little plea. Videos like this one aren't easy or cheap to make, so if you enjoy what you see, I'd really appreciate it if you share this video with a friend and subscribe to my channel. That helps me make more content like this. Now let's start at the beginning with some terms, because the term immigration gets thrown around so much that it sometimes loses its meaning. Immigration is quite simply the act of moving from one country to another and oftentimes settling there. That can be for a period of time or permanently. Anyone who immigrates is therefore an immigrant. Simple. There are many types of immigrants though. Some people immigrate for economic or professional reasons. This is a category that includes economic migrants and expats. Economic migrants tend to be people who move from a poorer country to a rich one for economic opportunity, usually for the medium to long term. An expat is someone who moves for a specific job that they already have, and they are normally short to medium term migrants. Then you have people who immigrate for safety reasons, for fear of violence or persecution in their home country. They normally apply for asylum. They therefore become asylum seekers. If their application is granted, they're given either a period of or permanent permission to settle in the country that they've fled to, as well as protection from the country that they've fled from. That makes them a refugee. Asylum seekers and refugees have rights to this under the 1951 United Nations Refugee Convention. There's oftentimes made a quite clear distinction between voluntary migrants or economic migrants and then asylum seekers and refugees. But in the political debate, the terms tend to bleed together. In this video, I'll be looking at both cases. But do remember the distinction. When we talk about the immigration debate, expats are normally excluded. In many cases, so are refugees who have already been granted asylum as well, making most of the debate, but not all of it, about economic migrants and asylum seekers who may or may not actually be granted asylum at a later date. Make sense? Good. So now let's turn to Denmark specifically. Denmark has, for much of its history, not necessarily been the most attractive place to immigrate to. Oftentimes, Danes have immigrated to other countries, like to the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. But that changed after the World Wars. Denmark then began receiving waves of immigrants and refugees from other countries. A wave of economic migrants and refugees from Germany in the late 1940s, a wave of guest workers from the Balkans and the Middle East in the 1960s, and then a series of waves of refugees from various countries in the 1980s and 1990s, including from the Middle East, from Sri Lanka, and from Vietnam. This wasn't always uncontroversial. It set a series of movements in motion politically that we can see today. Most importantly, in the way that it turned the Danish Progress Party, which was initially an anti-tax party, into a party that began more seriously discussing immigration. The party effectively collapsed in 1995 due to internal rifts and was revamped as the Danish People's Party, one of the main characters of this video. The Danish People's Party was and is a national conservative party that advocates for hardline measures of immigration and criticizes multiculturalism. In its first years of existence, it faced a cordon sanitaire from other parties who wouldn't work with it. In a famous statement from Denmark's third-way social democratic prime minister in the 1990s and early 2000s, Poul Nyrup Rasmussen, they were bluntly told,
"Stuerene, det bliver I aldrig."
Effectively, you'll never be considered clean and tame enough to work with. But that changed quickly. The party became one of the first national conservative parties in post-war Europe to be given influence. I asked one of their young up-and-coming parliamentarians, Mikkel Bjørn, why he thinks this was the case.
Dansk Folkeparti har jo været et af de første partier til at italesætte de udfordringer og de konsekvenser, der er forbundet med en stor import af mennesker fra navnlig Mellemøsten og Nordafrika. Det begyndte vi jo allerede på i 95, da partiet blev stiftet. Inden da var det Fremskridtspartiet med lidt mindre succes. Men Dansk Folkeparti har jo i de 30 år partiet har eksisteret været et pragmatisk parti, der har i hvert fald forsøgt at fremføre saglige argumenter for, hvorfor visse typer af indvandring er uhensigtsmæssige i stort omfang til Danmark. Og så tror jeg, at den danske befolkning er grundlæggende set et meget snusfornuftigt folk, som forholder sig til og lytter til argumenter, men også forholder sig til konsekvenser, de observerer i deres daglige tilværelse.
In 2001, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the leader of the liberal conservative Venstre party, formed a government in coalition with the Conservatives and with confidence and supply from the Danish People's Party. And that's where the Danish shift on immigration policy begins. I spoke to Louise Elholm, a member of the Danish parliament and former minister for Venstre, who has served in the Danish parliament for almost 20 years, to hear a bit about this shift.
Well, we took over power in 2001, and we did that with another policy than the former government had, because we had seen an increasing amount of immigrants to Denmark, and we did see that the crime rate was higher for this group, and they didn't participate in the society and in the workforce in the same amount as Danes did. Mm-hmm. So we did see some structural problems that we would like to solve. Mm-hmm. So in my party, in Venstre, there were a few people who was looking at what can we do to sharpen our policy and make sure that we stop this this unlucky tendency. But how can we make sure that we only get the ones who actually want to be part of Denmark and want to contribute? And how do we make sure that if they do not want to contribute, they feel they have to do something?
The policies introduced during this period include making family reunification standards much stricter. This is a system wherein Danish citizens or residents can bring their foreign spouse to Denmark. The age for people applicable was raised from 18 to 24. Strong ties to Denmark from the couple had to be established, and authorities clamped down on marriages of convenience. And the government also effectively abolished a de facto refugee status, a status for people who did not qualify under the UN Refugee Convention, but who Denmark believed to be at enough risk in their home country regardless. Immigrants without asylum seeker or refugee status who had been granted temporary residency permits would have to live in Denmark for much longer, 7 years, before they qualify for permanent residency. Integration was also emphasized as a strict requirement for migrants and refugees, including mandatory language and integration courses. In 2009, Fogh Rasmussen left Danish politics and became NATO Secretary General. But his replacement, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, kept the government formation and strict immigration policies. In 2010, a points-based system was introduced for granting permanent residency permission for immigrants. Its requirements included Danish language skills, employment history, and general integration and civil participation. Altogether, this made Denmark one of the strictest countries in Europe on immigration policy. It wasn't always met with much support from the rest of Europe or the broader international community, though. In 2011, Venstre lost the election and a left-of-centre coalition took power for 4 years. This period is a bit uninteresting from an immigration perspective. The new government largely kept immigration policy as it was, not tightening further, but also not rolling back any significant measures. Towards the end of this period, something else massive happened. The European refugee crisis that saw large numbers of Syrians, especially, travel to Europe for asylum. Images traveled across Europe and Denmark alike of refugees traveling northwards. In Denmark, it was especially this clip of refugees walking along the highway that received massive amounts of media coverage. Then, in 2015, Denmark experienced one of its history-making elections. The Social Democrats got the most votes, but the Danish People's Party comes in second, with Venstre in third place. The parties right of centre have a majority and form a series of governments under Venstre, with the Danish People's Party serving as an incredibly influential confidence and supply party. And this is the period many of you probably know Danish immigration policy for, because the government undertook a long series of tightenings of policy and really ramped up rhetoric on the area. This included checks at the border with Germany, shorter permits for migrants and refugees, the introduction of departure centers for failed asylum seekers awaiting deportation, longer waiting periods for family reunifications, special integration-focused policies for ghettos, the term used for areas in cities with particularly high percentages of migrants. And it also included the controversial jewelry law, where Danish authorities could confiscate valuable items from migrants and asylum seekers who came to Denmark. This elicited strong reactions, including this cartoon of the Prime Minister from The Guardian. I asked Louise Elholm about the international reactions to this Danish crackdown on immigration policy. This is what she said.
Well, I do think it was a bit tough because everyone was mad at us. There was, as I see it, we made a choice rather early compared to other countries that we would not accept just people coming up here and not wanting to be part of the community. And that's a choice we made rather early. The other countries, they are getting along now, but at that time they weren't there. It was the big heart, we will take everyone, and therefore there was not much understanding on our rather tough policy on immigration. And being the first mover and the first to do something here, we got a lot of criticism. And it could sometimes feel a bit tough, but we do believe it was the right choice we made. We can see that our numbers are much better than our neighboring countries. So we do believe it was the right choice, but we were not popular in the world with our choices.
Another tension-grabbing action from the Danish government was an advertising campaign the immigration minister launched in Middle Eastern newspapers, discouraging people from traveling to Denmark. But aside from the international reactions, many Danes were also uncomfortable with this. One such Dane was Michaela Bendiksen, the founder of Refugees Welcome and a prominent voice in the Danish immigration debate. She published a counter-op-ed in The Guardian, encouraging people to migrate and apply for refugee status in Denmark. I spoke to her about just this.
Yes, I wanted to kind of contradict what she was saying, because what she was saying was actually a lie. She was trying to scare people away from choosing Denmark or from ending up in Denmark somehow by saying that they would not get asylum and that they would not have a good future in Denmark, so they should choose some other country. And it wasn't true. I mean, all Syrians have been granted asylum in Denmark, and all Eritreans, basically. So with just like any other country in Europe, we are still following the Refugee Convention. Denmark is still a rule-based society, to some extent at least. So, I mean, if you have a strong asylum case, you will be granted asylum, and you will get even the best and most strong status, which is the convention status. Most people get that. And you will have the right to family unification. It will probably happen. You will have a quite successful and quite strong support system into your life in Denmark, in the municipalities. You will get support. You will have free language education. You will have support to find a job. You will have accommodation.
During this period as well, something else interesting happens. The Danish Social Democrats move rightwards under new leader Mette Frederiksen. They take a very hardline stance on immigration as well, after having previously lost many voters to the Danish People's Party. And for a while there was talk of a Danish consensus on immigration policy, something I asked Louise Elholm about.
Well, I do think time have changed, and a lot of both parties in Denmark, but also neighboring countries has changed the policy regarding immigration. So what we saw back in 2001, now it's much more consensus, both in Denmark, but also in our neighboring countries. So we were the first movers, but yes, there are a rather big consensus on a hard immigration line, and there's always someone who wants to be even harder. And we have a few parties who's not that hard, but mostly all parties are hard on immigration now.
In 2019, the Social Democrats take power again, holding on to the previous government's policies. In 2022, the Social Democrats form a new coalition government with Venstre and the socially liberal moderates. This new government has recently tried to tighten immigration politics too. Recently, they announced measures to try to make it easier to deport foreign residents in Denmark who have committed serious violent crimes and have been sentenced for more than a year's prison. This putting the government in a bit of a standoff with the European Convention on Human Rights. Venstre has also tried to further tighten their politics by suggesting Denmark leave the slightly obscure European Convention on Nationality. I asked Louise Elholm about why she and Venstre believe these extra measures are necessary.
Well, first of all, we would prefer to change the conventions and how they are interpreted. But if we cannot succeed in that, we will take this minor convention on citizenship. European Convention on Nationality, not all European countries are member of it already. But we would prefer to change the way it is interpreted, because right now it does not take the necessary concern for the victims. It shows concerns for the offenders more than for the victims. And we do think you have to believe in the victims first of all. So we would like to shift the focus to take care of the victims.
And that takes us to where we are today. So to get a better understanding of how the Danish asylum and refugee system works, we've traveled here to the Danish Refugee Council to hear more from Eva Singer about how the system works. I would just like to start by asking you, can you tell me a bit about the work that the Danish Refugee Council undertakes?
So the Danish Refugee Council is obviously a Danish organization. We were established in 1956 when a group of refugees came from Hungary to Denmark. So this is where we come from Danish roots, as we say. So in Denmark we work with integration of refugees, helping them to get along in society, helping them with jobs. We also help them with legal aid for asylum seekers from the time they arrive, and all through the asylum system and the asylum procedure, and we help them in various ways. Outside of Denmark, we are present in about 30 different countries where we assist refugees and internally displaced people in their home host communities with various forms of assistance. So depending on where we are in the world, but we're actually working in most of the countries where you will find refugees.
So you, of course, do a lot of work with the people going through the asylum seeking process to become refugees here in Denmark. Could you take me through what a standard asylum case looks like in Denmark?
Yeah. So first of all, of course, the biggest obstacle in a way is actually come to Denmark. So it can be really difficult. There's no way to apply for asylum outside of Europe or outside of Denmark. So you have to come here by other means, which means most people arrive here in an illegal fashion. Once they're here, they will apply for asylum with the Danish authorities, with the Danish Immigration Service. They will go through interviews. While they are in the procedure, they will be accommodated in reception centers. Some of these reception centers are run by the Danish Red Cross, and some of them are run by Danish municipalities. After they have going through the interviews at the Danish Immigration Service, they might be accepted as a refugee immediately at that stage, or if they are rejected, then the file will be sent automatically to the Refugee Appeals Board, which is like a small court, you could say. Then the Refugee Appeals Board will also consider the case. And if they are accepted at that stage, they will be given a residence permit. And then the next step is that they will be assigned to a municipality in Denmark, which will then be responsible for the integration plan of the individual refugee. If they are rejected, it means that they have to leave the country if they cannot apply for any other form of residence permit. And it could be that they can apply for family reunification, maybe. Maybe they can apply for work permit and so on. But if they don't have any legal possibility of remaining in Denmark, they will have to leave the country. That means in the first place they will be moved to a different center. We call them return centers, if they do not cooperate with the Danish authorities in returning to their home country.
People who apply for asylum, how many of them are normally granted asylum? Is it quite common that they're granted asylum? Is it quite rare? Could you?
Now, obviously, these percentages, they go up and down every year. We were, a few years ago, we were up at about more than 70% of all asylum seekers who were recognized as refugees. Now it's a bit lower. I think we're maybe about 40% or something like that. So it depends on the nationalities who come, obviously. And for many years, we had nationalities where almost everybody was granted refugee status. So, for example, Syrians. We had many people coming from Afghanistan who are also mostly, not all, but mostly of granted refugee status. We have people from Eritrea. Most of them are also granted refugee status. Now, of course, it has changed because the Syrians as a group has all their asylum applications have been put on hold for the past year. So that also affects the recognition rate.
There's been various Danish governments who have sort of tried to discourage increases to amount of asylum seekers coming to Denmark. Is Denmark still an attractive destination for an asylum seeker?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I think a lot of the people who come here do not necessarily choose to come to Denmark because sometimes it's the human smugglers who basically decide where they go. If they come here because they want to come to Denmark, it could be because they have family here already. And if you have family or at least a network, it often will be more easy to integrate if you get a residence permit. Often I hear that Denmark is a really difficult country as well. But if I compare with some of my colleagues in other countries, I still think that the Danish asylum system is actually quite well functioning. People are accommodated in reception centers. They're not living on the streets like you see in some other European countries. So we don't have the same kind of housing crisis, which also affect refugees. So I think sometimes the rumors about the Danish asylum system is worse than what this asylum system actually is when you get here.
But I don't think it's fair to argue that the Danish system is incredibly easy to navigate or massively lenient either.
Permanent residency has become a major issue. Not so long ago, it was actually automatic for refugees at some point. After 7 years, they would get permanent residency automatically if they still had a need of protection. Now they will never get it. Nobody gets permanent immediately. Everybody is starting off with permits of 1 or 2 years at a time, and it has to be like reassessed all the time. So it has become this kind of circular movement where you're never really certain about anything. You don't know anything about your future. And the criteria to obtain permanent residency and also citizenship have become very, very hard to meet, especially for the most vulnerable groups. Because the criteria are not kind of neutral, they are sort of, they're favoring people with high educations and high income and people who don't have any like mental problems or issues. So for refugees particularly and for women, it has become very hard to meet the criteria. So a lot of our work is applying for dispensation with regards to like doctor's statements and failed Danish language tests, etc. So for some people it has become really impossible. I regularly meet people who have spent maybe 30 years in Denmark and still are on a temporary permit, and which is crazy because Denmark is their home country.
For economic migrants, the requirements to move to Denmark are quite high. The most common way to get a residency permit, like with other countries, is of course through a job. But in Denmark there are strict and high requirements for this job. It must pay 552,000 Danish kroner, over $87,000 annually, or it must be a job in a vital sector. Students are also permitted, but must prove that they have the finances to sustain themselves during their study. Last year, the government made it more difficult to qualify as an international student after much controversy of a large number of Bangladeshi students at Roskilde University. And for permanent residency, the normal requirement is 8 years of living in Denmark, as well as requirements on work history, Danish language skills, a clean criminal record, having a residency, and not receiving state support. Certain easing exists for EU and UK citizens, for young people, and people with Danish ancestry. Altogether, these rules are some of the strictest for economic migrants in Western Europe. While much of the rest of Europe sometimes looks at Denmark as an example of a settled immigration debate, that is far from the truth. In making this video, I spoke to people who are very critical of the current policy. One saying it's too harsh, another saying it's too soft.
Well, some of the strict rules have had a positive impact. I wouldn't say all of them were stupid. Like the mandatory distribution of refugees between the municipalities is a great success, and other countries should learn from that. The policy of accommodation in the Danish almene boliger system is very successful. There's a lot of integration work being done there and support for newcomers. I'm not a big fan of the ghetto laws, but parts of it are already in effect in other ways with other names, which are more successful and more positive. But other rules have had a very, very strong negative impact. I mean, most of them. And I think, the worst ones I could mention is probably the criteria for permanent residency and citizenship, which, as I mentioned, are favoring the highly educated and the people who are able to have a high income, which is very unfair to the most vulnerable people who will end up with nothing. In many families, it's the mother who doesn't have a permanent residency and the rest of the family have. So that's an obvious gender discrimination issue too.
Jeg synes, den nuværende indvandringspolitik, eller den nuværende regerings indvandringspolitik, langt hen ad vejen er en katastrofe. Det er måske et stort ord, men den nuværende den nuværende regering har øget indvandringen fra de lande, vi har dårlige erfaringer med, ret markant. Altså da den borgerlige regering overlod regeringsmagten til Socialdemokratiet i 2019, der var nettoindvandringen fra islamiske lande, den var stort set reduceret til nulniveau. Siden da har man år for år øget indvandringen fra de selv samme lande, og vi har nu årligt en gennemsnitlig indvandring på omkring 5-6.000 om året fra de lande. Det synes jeg er bekymrende, fordi selvom Danmark står et andet sted, også et mere hensigtsmæssigt sted, det vil jeg også langt hen ad vejen tilskrive Dansk Folkepartis indflydelse igennem 30 år, end mange andre europæiske lande, Sverige, Tyskland, Frankrig, Belgien, man kunne nævne i flæng, så har vi jo også vores egne, også mange steder ret massive udfordringer og problemer. Og jeg mener ikke, at det i den nuværende situation er ansvarligt at fortsætte eller forværre de problemer, vi allerede i forvejen har. Så den nuværende regering fører ikke en ansvarlig udlændingepolitik, men det er klart, at sammenlignet med mange andre europæiske lande, fører de da en mere relativt set hensigtsmæssig udlændingepolitik, end mange af de lande gør. Men grundlæggende set mener jeg jo, at vi er nødt til at tage nu efterhånden 30-40 års erfaringer med islamisk indvandring til efterretning og forsøge at navigere mere hensigtsmæssigt i fremtiden i de her spørgsmål.
There's even disagreements about specific parts of this issue area. For example, whether Denmark has an obligation and a responsibility to accept asylum seekers.
Not immigrants. I mean, immigrants are that it's their free choice where to go, and it's a capitalistic issue, like where to find a job, where to take your education. It's not really something that has to do with morality or with international obligations. But refugees, of course, we have a very clear responsibility. As one of the most safe and most rich and stable countries in the world, we have a huge responsibility to take parts of those millions of people who are stuck forever in other countries than their own, who cannot stay in their own country for many reasons, usually because of oppression, persecution, wars. I mean, this number of refugees globally is going up every year, and it's a disaster. No countries are really stepping up on this. Everybody's trying to avoid it. And Denmark has been, unfortunately, one of the worst ones, one of the front runners to kind of push this responsibility away. I mean, the Prime Minister says directly, the zero is zero refugees. How can you say something like that when you are a signature to a number of conventions that ensures the right of refugees? It's very depressing to see a person like Mette Frederiksen saying something like this. And it's not only bad for Denmark and for the refugees, it's also bad for the rest of the world to send an image like this, to send a message such as she does. And I think she has also, the way that the Social Democrats and also Venstre have been like normalizing the xenophobia has been a strong factor of urging the extreme right to become even more extreme. They have the responsibility, in my view, of Danish People's Party and other parties to become even more extreme and start talking about remigration and all these crazy thoughts. Because they are normalizing it. It has become mainstream and acceptable to say that people from certain countries are not worth anything. And it's our right to just keep our borders closed and to not feel any responsibility of the disasters and the crisis in the world. It's not our problem.
Juridisk er vi jo forpligtet på det jævnfør flygtningekonventionen. Det så jeg gerne, vi tog et opgør med retten til spontan asyl i Danmark. Moralsk, nej. Altså moralsk mener jeg jo grundlæggende, at vi som folkevalgte i Danmark er sat i verden for at varetage danskernes interesser og sørge for, at Danmark også på sigt er et lige så trygt, sikkert og velstående land, som det vi selv er opvokset i. Og så er det ikke en god idé at tillade stor import af mennesker fra lande, der værdimæssigt er meget, meget anderledes end danskerne er, som de er flest. Og det kan vi jo også se, at vi har bare boligområder i Danmark også, der er gået fra de sidste 30 år at være helt almindelige, trygge danske boligområder, præget af dansk kultur, danske normer, danske værdier og dansk sprog, til at være islamiske parallelsamfund præget af islamiske normer og grundlæggende islamisk kultur. Det synes jeg ikke er en positiv udvikling, som vi har været vidne til, og jeg så gerne den udvikling i det omfang, det kan lade sig gøre, blive rullet tilbage.
When criticizing the current government, the Danish People's Party often turns to growing numbers of immigration from Muslim countries.
Bare se ud af tallene, nu har jeg selv taget dem med her i dag, at der er grundlæggende set meget massiv forskel på en borgerlig og en socialdemokratisk udlændingepolitik. Socialdemokratiet vil henvise til et gennemsnitstal under den daværende borgerlige regering og sige, at den islamiske indvandring var større under den borgerlige regering. Det skyldes navnligt det første år af den borgerlige regering, hvor flygtningekrisen i Europa var på sit absolut højeste, og hvor den borgerlige regering kort tid efter satte rigtig mange initiativer i søen for at begrænse indvandringen fra de her områder af verden. Man gik fra, og det er jo relativt set til andre europæiske lande, stadig væsentligt færre, men man gik fra det første år, lige efter man har overtaget regeringsmagten fra en socialdemokratisk regering, som de facto havde efterladt dansk udlændingepolitik og dansk grænsepolitik i ruiner, med en kæmpe tilstrømning ind over danske grænser på 14.982 om året netto. Allerede året efter er det tal omtrent halveret til 8.000 nettoindvandrere fra islamiske lande. Året efter igen 3.142, og det sidste år 907. Da den socialdemokratiske regering overtager, er der i det første år af deres regeringsperiode i 2019 en islamisk nettoindvandring på Danmark på blot 208 mennesker om året. Allerede året efter øger man nettoindvandringen til 1877, året efter igen til 2364, året efter igen 3500, året efter 6.000 og året efter igen 6.000. Så der er jo forskel på effekten af de initiativer, som regeringerne har ført. Og Socialdemokratiets fortælling i offentligheden er jo, at de har fået styr på tilstrømningen. Og hvis man skal tage deres egne ord for gode varer, så er konsekvensen af den melding jo, at når den socialdemokratiske regering har øget den islamiske nettoindvandring på Danmark, ja, så er det på eget initiativ. Altså så er det ikke noget, der er uden for deres kontrol. Fordi hvis de har styr på tilstrømningen i øjeblikket, og de aktivt har øget tilstrømningen, ja, så må det være en konsekvens af deres egne politiske beslutninger. Hvorimod konsekvenserne af den daværende borgerlige regerings politiske beslutninger var, at migrationen blev mindsket meget markant til Danmark fra de her områder af verden. Men Socialdemokratiet er meget dygtige til og har en meget, meget effektiv spinmaskine i forhold til at formidle en, vil jeg sige, ahistorisk version af, hvordan det her er foregået.
Politicians and organizations alike also disagree about whether or not integration in Denmark has been a success.
Relativt set til andre lande, ja, vi har haft en mindre indvandring, særligt de sidste årtier, end andre europæiske lande. Vi har også været tidligere til at stille krav. Dansk Folkeparti var jo nogle af de første, der krævede, at vi skulle begynde at stille nogle mere håndfaste krav til mennesker, der kom hertil. Og det har jo haft en positiv indvirkning, men vi har også i Danmark mennesker, der har boet her i årtier, som ikke taler det danske sprog, som bor isoleret i et parallelsamfund, kun omgås eller mennesker, der også kommer fra samme egne af verden, taler det samme fremmede sprog og lever efter samme fremmede værdier og normer, som det land, man kommer fra. Og det er jo ikke positivt, og det tyder på, at vi ikke har stillet nok krav til de mennesker, der kommer til, eller at vi måske grundlæggende set ikke skulle have lukket så stort omfang af de mennesker ind.
Well, you can, if you look at the criteria that are usually measured when you talk about integration, of course integration is much more subtle and much more complicated than this, but there are some measurable things that internationally are agreed upon as kind of criteria to see if integration is successful or not. And Denmark is ranking very, very high on those criteria. The ministry has a website called the Integration Barometer, where you can see the 9 focus points that changing governments over the years have agreed to kind of keep an eye on. And they're all successful, they're all going in the right direction, except for language and citizenship, like active participation in society. And those two things, I think they can be closely related to the policy of temporariness. Because what's the point of learning Danish and what's the point of participating as an active citizen in society if you face this threat of being kicked out constantly and if you meet this image of being unwelcome?
So at that point, what is the rest of Europe even supposed to take away from this? Well, Louise Elholm suggested that.
Well, strict and fair. You need to be strict and fair. There needs to be no incentive to do wrong. You have to make sure that people have incentives to contribute and that you have strict rules if people do not apply the rule of law. But at the same time, you have to be fair. And of course, I do think when we have a policy like this, it's also important that you have a focus to help the countries where they come from to develop in a better direction. So the pressure on Europe won't be that big. That's also a focus point. So you have to have strict rules at home, but also try to help them to build up their own countries so they have something to move back to.
However, Mikkel Bjørn argues.
Grundlæggende set, så mener jeg jo, at alt kan jo lade sig gøre, og man skal lade være med at købe en fortælling om, at der er nogle ting, vi ikke kan gøre. Altså, der er nogle ting, vi ikke skal gøre, og der er nogle ting, der ikke er hensigtsmæssige at gøre. Men der er ikke noget, vi ikke kan gøre, hvis den politiske vilje er der. Og det synes jeg i virkeligheden er den største løgn, ikke bare i dansk udlændingepolitik, men i europæisk udlændingepolitik, at der er skabt nogle problemer af uansvarlige politikere, men der er ikke noget at gøre ved det. Nogle af konsekvenserne er vi bare nødt til at leve med. Jeg mener, at meget kan gøres, og meget bør gøres, og jeg vil meget nødigt købe ind på en fortælling om, at vi ikke kan, hvis vi vil. Hvor der er vilje, er der vej, siger man jo i Danmark, og det køber jeg grundlæggende ind på.
And Mikaela Bendiksen argues that.
But if we keep telling people that they're wrong and they're not welcome and they should leave any day, it's not going to work. And we need these people in Europe, not only in Denmark. All of Europe is desperately in need of young people. And refugees are generally young people and they have children with them. So why not use the refugees who are in need of a safe place and make them also become part of the Danish and European labor markets and welfare system where they're actually needed. It's a win-win situation in my view to accept more refugees. And we know what's working. We have a lot of experience and knowledge and studies about these things. So if we just stop this policy of deterrence, the deterrence and the xenophobia is actually what's ruining the whole thing.
So maybe the debate in Denmark isn't as settled or consensus-filled as I think a lot of people like to think. And with the Danish parliamentary election fast approaching, I think these differences will come to the fore once again.
Denmark is about to have an election very soon. Just as we were walking into the building and up through the building, I've heard numerous people whispering about it. Do you think this is going to be an election focused on immigration policy?
It's always an election focused on immigration policy, so it will be this again. I'm not sure it will be the main point, but it will certainly play a role. It always does.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel. I'd also like to thank Frederik Ravn, who helped with all the videography and the editing for this project. You can follow him up there. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.